So anyway, lovely. Thank you all for making not only the trek to this hotel, but then the trek through the hotel to find the room. So yeah, lovely to see you all here. And I just wanted to say as well, at the back of the room, we've got T-shirts and lanyards and some of our wonderful books for sale. So do go and look at that, the merchandise afterwards when you've got some time. Okay, so we've got the wonderful Alison Jenner chairing today. She's vice chair of Live Voice for Women, and I'm the chair, Zoe Hollowood, for Live Voice for Women. And she's going to introduce our amazing speakers. We've got Stella and we've got Stephanie here, and she'll tell you a bit more about them. The topic we feel is very topical given the news that we've had this week, both on WPATH and puberty blockers, and they'll come on to that. I'd like to also say welcome to our Zoom audience, and please, for those who are on Zoom, do type in your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure we get to them in Q&A. For the rest of you, we'll have a roving mic, and we'll come round at the end so everyone can get their questions in. And we are liberals, and we might disagree with each other, but here is a forum to ask those questions and get those questions answered that you always wanted answered. So do please stay and ask your questions at the end, and obviously I'm sure Stella and Stephanie will be able to answer one-on-one as well. All right, thanks so much. I'll hand over to Alison.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the second time that these wonderful women have spoken to us. They were part of our second ever Zoom event, which is on my YouTube channel, and it's called First Do No Harm. And actually, Heather Brunskill-Evans was with us then. But I can just give you a brief introduction. You've probably seen our flyer cards, so I won't label it to go on too long. But Stella O'Malley is a psychotherapist, author, and was a presenter of the 2018, I think it was, Channel 4 programme documentary, Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk. She's the founder and director of GenSpec, which is an international organisation keen to offer a balanced perspective in sex and gender. And she's going to talk to us in large terms about the medical and community aspects of that. Next to her is Stephanie Davies-Arai, which is Empire Medal. And Stephanie is the founder and director of Transgender Trend. She was shortlisted for the John Maddox Prize for the School's Guide supporting gender diverse and trans-identified students in schools. And a copy of that is available on the back table. She was allowed to intervene in the judicial review brought by Kira Bell and Mrs. A back in, I think that was 2018 or 2019? 2020, there we go. And she was the only intervener permitted to do so because she put in the work and made a bundle of evidence which hadn't already been presented in the main bundles. And other people, other organisations with lots of funding and paid staff couldn't get their bundle in on time. I'm saying that. Since then, she's gone on to great renown and has done a lot of really good work. Stella's book, which is written with herself, Lisa Marciano and Sasha Ayad, is a really great guide. It's well worth reading if you've got any family who identify as transgender, and it's a guide for parents who need to navigate around, sometimes coming to terms and accepting your child or your relation's trans identity, but other ways in which sometimes it's not appropriate, how to help them work themselves out their own future. I'm sorry, it's a brilliant book. I'm just trying to condense it very briefly, but I'm going to hand over it first to you, Stella, and then you're going to speak, then we're going to have Stephanie speaking, and then we'll open up the questions, because I think that some of your questions may be directed at either or both of them. Okay, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. Wow, what a beautiful place York is. I've never been here. And no, I've never been here, and I was just getting the history there from Alison. Really, really beautiful, beautiful place. I'm delighted to be here. I was at a kind of a similar type meeting in Dublin just before Christmas, and a lot of things came from that meeting. I do think these small political meetings can have a huge impact because people often are afraid to talk about, sex, gender, trans issues. And then when they learn a little bit about it, they feel often quite empowered to learn more and to speak up. And I hope people do as a result of listening to myself and Stephanie today. I'm a psychotherapist based in Ireland, and I got into this issue kind of inadvertently. I was always a general psychotherapist, but I was invited to do that film back in 2018. The reason why was because I had written an article about how I'd been a very gender distressed kid, for want of a better phrase, when I was a kid back in the 70s and 80s. And I just wondered, could any of the 4,000% rise in teenage girls seeking medical transition, could any of them be like me? Because I grew up, puberty ended up being the thing that pulled me out of gender distress. It doesn't pull everybody out, but it was the thing that actually, so imagine I was born, a female, 1974. I became obsessed, would be a good word, at yeah. All I think is on mine, I'm happy. I became obsessed with becoming a boy and being a boy from the age of 3. So I had what would be known as early onset childhood gender dysphoria. Back then it would have been called something like gender identity disorder. And I had it for many, many years. I was certainly consistent, insistent, and persistent. And when I hit puberty, it was harrowing. It was a horrible experience. It was very, very difficult. Puberty lasts some years. With puberty comes a sexual awakening, which was, for me, my savior, if you follow me. Starting to, I think when people start talking about puberty blockers, and I'll talk a little bit more in a minute, but we underestimate the social, cognitive, the psychological impact of moving from being a kid who's in a childlike state, I'll talk about it now, being a kid in a childlike state who's thinking, I want cake, I want my friends, I want toys, to being a sexually developed person who wants to fall in love with somebody else and have a mate. And with that awakening comes often that loneliness of adolescence. If you think about the love songs, the films, poetry that you kind of get into during adolescence, to me, it's no accident. We haven't really figured out what is going on when that sexual awakening happens between 10 and 20, roughly those ages. But we can see what a child is and how socially kind of we change and become other-oriented as we search for a mate. And we ultimately find a mate. That's the grand plan. And some of us do find a mate. And so that happened to me. That sexual awakening, which was a slow process, I'm realizing I wanted to fall in love, and I was falling in love, and other people falling in love with me ultimately made me comfortable in my own skin. That was a long, interestingly, psychologically deep process. And so puberty blockers, which is, I'm very, very pleased, have been banned by NHS England, certainly outside clinical trials, they won't go ahead, and outside. I think we need to be concerned about private clinics and online clinics, but certainly NHS have stepped up and done something I think very life-changing and very important. Because stopping puberty, I would say, is a very barbaric, very high-handed, authoritarian intervention for a child, because we do not know what happens when we block a child's sexual development. We do know that their bones are impaired, they're weakened, and we do know that their neuropsychological functioning is effectively stunted. It's blocked as they are, and not only that, obviously their sexual awakening is blocked. The growth of their genitals is blocked. This is a serious intervention. And just so you know, because I know there's some information being put out about this, roughly 98% of children whose puberty is blocked go on to medically transition. I don't argue with that. The fact is, once you have blocked somebody's puberty, you've carried out a very significant medical intervention that will already, a person's identity has been medicalized. So if you stop somebody's puberty at 12, let's say, and their genitals don't grow, their breasts don't grow, and if they're a boy, their penis won't grow, and then they now are living in an out of sync world with their peers. Their peers are having crushes. which is part of that sexual development. They're not having crushes. They're still, if you follow me, in the childlike state because they're not having a sexual development. I know I go straight into all the facts, and I know it's quite detailed, but I think it's really important that we really confront what it is when we block a child's puberty. Stephanie's going to talk about schools, and I'm sure we'll go much more into the social transition part of things. But I think it's very important that we are aware that this is such a significant intervention. And I welcome questions, especially questions that don't agree with me, that come up afterwards, because the more we can deal with the facts, the better. So on that subject about the puberty blockers, if a child from the kind of old days, which I'm from, where we were allowed to go through our sexual development unfettered, if a child with my, what would have been my experience, around about, it's about 12 studies that have ever been conducted of children who have been like me, who had that kind of extreme gender distress. And, anything from, roughly 80% of the children end up becoming comfortable in their own skin. It's very important to note that these would be children who were brought to clinics. These were children who were very much the sharp edge of gender distress, if you were getting so far as to be brought to a clinic in other generations, because not that many were. But also it's very important to note that 70 to 80% of those children would end up being gay, lesbian, or bisexual. And so you and I know this intuitively. We look at the little 4-year-old feminine boy who's running around in a fairy dress, and we kind of presume that one day he might come out as gay. And it's not a shock when we meet him 20 years later, and he is gay. So there's a kind of a received wisdom about a lot of these children that isn't off kilter, but they are, very often are. Why they are is very interesting. We could have a whole webinar on that or at conference, but it's still, it's statistically quite reliable that they are highly likely, not always. I didn't end up being lesbian or bisexual, but very highly likely. Since I have grown up, there has been a new cohort has arrived. They arrived in the last 10 years, 12 years in higher numbers. And so historically, there was two main people who sought to be the opposite sex. One was the children that I was, when they were determined they should be, a girl or a boy, and generally the whole town knows about it when it's a child like that. It's coming on them between the ages of 3 and 6. I was classic, typical example, and they tell everybody they are still very childlike and they're engaging in magical thinking, and I did, and they thought my force of personality will get this over the line. Like, God bless me, my arrogance. And it's interesting because I remember I used to intimidate and impress adults in the room about how deep I go, because they'd ask me questions. The kids aren't fools. And so they'd ask me questions leading to see how far will I go with this. And I'd be looking at them saying, all the way, yeah. Take me, you know what I mean? So it was interesting that, like, that force of personality, I think is very interesting when you start thinking of these kids, because I'll always get parents who say to me, oh, but you don't know how pushy they are about it. And I'm like, oh, I do. Oh, I definitely do. And so that's one type of cohort that was historically there. There was a second type of person who sought medical transition, and that was generally middle-aged males. And they have been there, and they're an interesting kind of cohort in themselves. And very often they are erotically fixated with the idea of being a woman. It's called autogynephilia. It's called also transvestic disorder. It's in the DSM, which is the kind of diagnostic statistical manual for people like myself, psychology and psychotherapy and diagnosis. And it is a very obsessive thought compulsion to be seen as a man, for a man, a heterosexual man, to be seen as a woman, to be perceived as a woman. Very often when you speak about this, it's highly controversial, and I kind of get into trouble every time I seem to mention the word, and yet I continue. That 3-year-old kid hasn't quite gone away. But so they were the two cohorts, and there's an awful lot to be said because it's very complex. Anybody who's trying to say sex and gender isn't. These are huge. The essence of what it is that makes me a woman Are you a man? It goes as deep as it goes. Is it the fact that I was born in my body and I will die as my body and my body is female? Or how much is it the estrogen and progesterone that courses through my body? How much is impacting any of us? I don't know, and I don't think any of us know. I know that there are hits of testosterone, let's say the boy will get in the womb at 3, at 6, and then obviously the grand event in puberty. So there's quite a few different hits of testosterone that the boy will get. Hence, little boys like a rough and tumble play. So, and lots of other things. That's just a kind of a throwaway remark. But I do want to point out that I just see the time. Yeah, I want to have a little bit more time. So I want to point out that there was 2 cohorts, as I said, children and middle-aged males. Middle-aged males generally erotically fixated. Children, very intense, very often grow up to be gay or lesbian or bisexual. And then a 3rd cohort arrived out of nowhere, came in like a rocket and hasn't been seen before. And this has been studied a little bit, but we don't know very much about this. They seem to have spent an extended period of time online with very high rates of comorbidities. Very, very often they have autism, they have ADHD, they have OCD, they have eating disorders. This is a highly vulnerable type of person. Very often they're teenagers, but not always. Sometimes they're young adults, but they are young, they're vulnerable, they're often gullible, they're very often very cerebral, they're very much a type, and you would know this type, kind of geeky, naive, vulnerable, a little bit disconnected from their body, often really intelligent and creative. And they have come in, like I say, like a rocket out of nowhere. They will have spent a lot of time online and they have found a community. They've often had a trauma, perhaps because of their comorbidities, they might be lonely. And they found a sense of belonging in the LGBTQ plus community. And they joined, and very often, first of all, they'll come out as lesbian or gay, and then they'll come out as trans. Might have a few different, they might cycle a few different identities. And the parents will say, sure, this is one of the long line of diagnosis. The child will say, this is the answer to all my distress. I was lonely, I hated myself, I wasn't connected with my body, I hated my body, and then I found out I was trans, and now I have the answer to all my distress. And there's nothing more annoying, arguably, than like to be told you could be a different person with a different body and a different identity. And nobody will be able to refer to that old identity because you're going to be something new and you can create that person. It is psychologically very exciting to think, I can start again. It reminds me of the E. Cummings, the line in the poem where he says, there's another universe, are you coming? Let's start me again. I'm not happy with how I turned out. I'm 14, I have autism and I'm lonely and I'm lost. I'm going to start again. So that child arguably needs a lot of gentle care around them because they think they have a solution to their problems. And I often work with teenagers and they often, I often highlight the fact that they believe that these golden people live in golden lives and everybody else is living these golden lives and it's all lovely. And they have a condition which prevents them. It's very often it's autism or ADHD. But they think they can't be happy. And I spent a lot of my time working as a psychotherapist going, no, we're all agonizing through life. Angst is a friend of mine. You wake up in the morning and you're worrying about this and you're fretting about that and you think you've done this and you might have hurt this person and you're feeling hostile to that person. And angst is just a part of the human condition. I feel an awful lot of children in the way we have created the world, and I really recommend Abigail Shire's new book, Bad Therapy, where we're kind of telling them that there is this happy life out there. And if they're not happy, they need to complain to their nearest adult, who should probably take it upon themselves to fix it. And it's leading gullible children down a really, really dangerous path where they think there's something wrong with them because they're not happy, rather than life is hard and they're not happy. And so when we think about things like the conversion therapy bill, we have to confront the fact that the clinicians have always for about 150 years explored everything within our offices, if you follow me. That's the idea. When somebody comes to me, the idea is there is no taboo. You can go to your dark side. You can discuss the fact that, like, of really shameful things, dark thoughts, really kind of mean things you're thinking about your mommy or your daddy or your friend, your jealousies, you know what I mean, your rivalries. That's the idea of a therapeutic process. That is an ethical therapeutic process. And so for people to come in and legislate around conversion therapy, and right now it's been pushed off in the UK. I've no doubt it will come back as an issue at some stage, and it's something that we need to be very, very careful around, because it's effectively politicians who mightn't understand what a therapeutic process is, trying to say what you can say and what you can't say in a process. So I want to say very, very clearly that no ethical therapist will have a planned outcome for a child or an adult. What they will have is an exploratory environment where nothing is taboo and where we explore everything. I don't know, if a client comes to me and they want to move to Alaska, I hold space. So I don't want to live in Alaska. I think they're mad living in Alaska. I don't care. I'm not them. So that's not my job. My job is to make sure that I hold space for them and we explore all the options around it, that they've pressure tested it in a large way, and that they feel strong and confident and competent to go to Alaska if they so wish. And so that's what I would say about anything to do with medical transition, that to feel confident, you need to feel competent. And to feel competent, you need to have explored all the issues. And if there's a feeling like you can't explore A and B because it will upset you, you will have a lack of confidence. You will not feel strong in yourself. You won't have that kind of ice in your tummy ready to go for it, because you will have avoided certain issues. So a good therapeutic process will kind of say to the client, you know, you might change your mind to align with your body, or you might change your body to align with your mind. That's your choice. You can change your mind to align with your body. These days, you can change your body to align with your mind. That's going to be your choice. My job as a therapist is to make sure that we explore all your options, that you're aware of all your options, that nothing is unsaid, that maybe I improve your help you improve your coping skills, your emotional regulation, your distress tolerance, all the things that therapists are very well versed in, while you figure out if you're going to change your body or you're going to change your mind, because that's your job. Do you know what I mean? So we don't need to be worried about conversion therapy. Conversion therapy has this barbaric history. We're back in other decades, you know, frankly, very authoritarian therapists were trying to convert people from being gay, lesbian or bisexual to being straight. And they use things like forced watching of porn and really ECT. Some really, really awful things happened in other decades. They're not happening in any ethical therapist's office, certainly in England or Ireland or Europe. And it's funny because in Ireland they tried to do a scoping survey in Europe, and England was included, to find out where is this conversion therapy happening. And the first study, in the last 20 years, they tried to find out where is the conversion therapy happening. The first study didn't come up with anything. This is 2020. And so then the minister in charge decided to do another scoping survey, but this time he allowed in online anonymous surveys. And then suddenly, when he allowed in the online anonymous surveys, suddenly there was loads of evidence of conversion therapy. But the first study that just wanted reliable evidence couldn't find any. And what they did find is that there are, you know, a very extreme religious zealots who are carrying out exorcism, and they are also offering conversion therapy. But that's religious zealots. That's nowhere near therapy. And I want to be very strong in this, that if anybody wants to legislate around that, you know, if you want to legislate around religious zealots, that's a very arguable point for somebody else to argue. But certainly it has nothing to do with ethical therapy, where we're kind of lighting scented candles and it's a very warm room and it's cushions and it's exploring issues. And I really have to say there's a big gulf between these two kind of processes. And I think it's very important as well that we're aware that this postmodern understanding of conversion therapy, so previously it was always about sexual orientation, and it was for many decades. And if you ask the general public who don't know much about trans and gender issues, they'll presume it's about, people being converted out of being gay, lesbian, or bisexual. But since roughly around 2015, there's been a kind of a new, like I call it, a postmodern understanding of conversion therapy, where they suddenly stuck in the phrase gender identity. And suddenly the idea to explore it became a lot more nebulous, and people weren't quite sure what they could talk about, what they couldn't. And it's not that all these huge high number of therapists are being accused of conversion therapy. What's happened is a chilling effect, which is much more damaging, which means therapists won't touch it. Once you talk about gender issues, they are sending you off to clinics, to specialists, because the therapists don't want to go anywhere near something where that could basically ruin their livelihood. And so it's not that I think we should worry about all the therapists going to jail. We should worry about all the young people not receiving therapy because therapists won't go near it. And that's where I found is really, really a genuinely a big worry. And I think I urge you, any of you who know therapists, to kind of consider, help them to welcome them in. I've run the organisation GenSpect, and we offer a non-medicalised approach to gender-related distress. And we have a therapeutic funded program for people who've been hurt by medical transition. These are mostly detransitioners, but not always. These are people who've medically transitioned and feel they've been hurt by the process and they're not happy. So we offer funding for therapy. And I find that the therapists will work with them a lot faster than they'll work with gender distressed children, because they're afraid to work with gender distressed children, because they're afraid of accusations. And that's where politicians can really kind of step up and be very clear in the language. The problem here is badly worded laws that are making everybody, and I've no doubt lots of you here, feel uncertain. And that uncertainty silences people, because they don't quite know what they're talking about, so they're afraid to talk about it very much, afraid to ask a question. And I love the fact that myself and Stephanie are here to say, don't be afraid, please ask questions, and we'd be delighted to answer. I'm going to be finishing it in a minute or two. I want to kind of, before I hand it over to Stephanie, want to point out a couple of things that very often come up. So I just want to anticipate them. So to get into deeper reads with the questions. One is sex and gender, even in a phrase, what is sex, what is gender? Lots of people have lots of different interpretations. I think most people are very pleased with the idea that sex is the body you're born in. It's determined by your body. Gender is a very incendiary word that a lot of people disagree with even saying it this age. And other people say it means everything. If it means everything, then it means nothing. You know what I mean? Trans is an umbrella term for anybody who identifies as trans. Gender could be considered a social construct that represents femininity, masculinity, or something else. So you can be, for example, masculine woman or feminine man. So some people see gender as a social construct that is just femininity or masculinity, or non-binary opting out. But some people don't. So it's a nebulous word that makes people very nervous, very afraid to talk about. And I think the more we speak about it, the better. I do want to highlight in the British legislation, gender has been kind of used as a synonym with sex in a shoddily worded bill. And I think a shoddily worded legislation. And that's very unfortunate because, when you've got to be clear when talking about sex or gender. The last thing, just before I finish, is a lot of people worry about suicidality with gender and gender-related distress. I think it's very important that we look to the actual facts around suicide, because every suicide is a tragedy. It's devastating for people, and people really need to know exactly what they're talking about when they're talking about that. And what it is that we know is that out of 10 years, between 2010 and 2020, 15,000 children were either being treated in JIDS, the Tavistock, or else they were on the waiting list for JIDS. And out of those 15,000 children, 4 children died by suicide. 2 of them were on the waiting list, 2 of them were getting treatment. And so while that is 4 tragedies and utterly devastating, it is not higher than other mental health issues. It is not a reason for us to suddenly fast track experimental treatments that haven't been touched before. I didn't get a chance to talk about the Living Path files, but I do want to say that if you can have a look at them, you'd be aware that this is an organisation that isn't clinical, it's not medical or scientific, it's a ramshackle organisation that has left medical ethics behind quite profoundly. And I encourage you to look up the Environmental Progress website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stella. That was a great tour d'horizon. A quick run round the horizon of what our subject is about time to rethink these processes. I'm going to call on Stephanie to talk to us now. There will be time for questions afterwards, so do hang on to questions, and there will be questions. There will be questions in the chat as well online. So over to you, Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you. Great, that was a great introduction, so I don't have to say as much to put this in context, but speaking to a group of Lib Dems, I just want to bring my talk into context. In 2015, I wrote a piece which was published in the Wales Arts Review called The Transgender Experiment on Kids, and I did mention the Lib Dems in that, who just voted to allow children to take puberty blockers while they were waiting for cross-sex hormones. And here we are this week, having seen the NHS ban the use of puberty blockers for very good reasons. So I do hope the Lib Dems follow suit and look at those policies. One of my biggest concerns about puberty blockers is the effects on the brain, that we don't know whether they are reversible or not. It's a hugely important time for brain development when the sex hormones, either male or female, there's a surge in sex hormones, and they are responsible for growth, and that's every part of the body. That's not just secondary sex characteristics, and that includes the brain. So there are worrying studies from children given blockers for precocious puberty, which they are licensed for, of a drop in IQ points. And a drop in IQ points can be really serious. It can take somebody with a low IQ to borderline learning disabled. It's really, really critical. It's a critical time for neurological development. It is great news that the NHS have made this decision. However, children can still be, as far as we know, are going to be given cross-sex hormones at age 16. It's not over yet. We do know how irreversible the effects of cross-sex hormones are. It used to be said, and the NHS changed this a few years ago, that puberty blockers are fully reversible. We know that that's not true now, but we have always known that cross-sex hormones have irreversible lifelong effects. So there's still work to be done, and I want to put this in the wider context of what's called gender-affirming care. Cross-sex hormones are actually called gender-affirming hormones, and the social approach of gender affirmation, you may hear it called social transition in schools. That's come up. So another thing that's come up recently is the government's draft schools guidance. So historically, the way if a child had a cross-sex identity, they would be treated by, it was a universally accepted approach called watchful waiting, and that was developmentally informed. And it was based on the understanding that children were still in the process of development, and that transsexual was one of a number of possible outcomes. And in fact, it was the least likely outcome in adulthood. And as Stella said, the most likely is the child would be gay, lesbian, or bisexual. But and those children would become homosexual transsexuals. I think that's the difference as well. But anyway, we have 12 studies from, historic studies that look at how many children persist in that cross-sex identity into adulthood and how many desist. And from those 12 studies, it's around 80% desist, so they grow out of those feelings. And the only comparison we have really is a study done last year by Kirsten Olsen in the US. And she studied a group of children who had been affirmed, socially transitioned, using a new approach of gender affirmation. Only 4% of that group desisted. So there was a huge difference. I mean, and that's as far as I know, the first study done of children under the gender affirmative approach. But the difference is the gender affirmative approach was not clinically developed. It was brought in as part of the global trans rights activist movement. And it doesn't yet have any evidence to support it, or to support the fact that it's safe. But there is concern that and in fact studies have been done in the past as far back as 2013 to show that social transition is a very strong predictor of persistence of feelings of cross-sex identity. And I think that just makes sense, that if you're telling a little boy he's a girl every day, and his parents are telling him and his teachers are telling him, then really it's almost a foregone conclusion that he will hold on to that belief because of course he trusts the adults in his life. But as Stella said, actually now the huge rise in referrals has been fueled by teenage girls, not little boys as it used to be. And the approach of gender affirmation has sort of become embedded everywhere. And it's one of the issues with the government schools guidance. And so I want to just talk about, puberty blockers are sort of, in a way, the end point of gender affirmation. In fact, they're the beginning of the medical pathway. But the gender affirmative social approach I see as a social experiment, just as the gender affirming medical approach is a medical experiment. So the consultation's just closed, and I think the guidance had very good intentions, but it's left loopholes that I think activist teachers and activist parents will quite easily exploit. And all the trans and LGBT lobby groups have strongly opposed the guidance as we expected. But we've also had opposition to it from the teaching unions, child charities, and clinical professional bodies, the counselling bodies. So there is a lot of opposition to any schools guidance that does not use the gender affirmative approach. But I want to just look at two responses I've seen, apart from the activists, that I've seen to the government's proposed draft schools guidance, because these responses carry more weight than the activist responses, and they're likely to be influential. And the first one is the Confederation of School Trusts, or CST, I'll call them, and the other is the Equality and Human Rights Commission, EHRC. And both of them focus on the law in this area, and both express concerns that certain non-gender affirmative policies may be unlawful or discriminatory, or are simply unsupportive of the child and not very nice. The CST focuses on child safeguarding guidance, such as the Department for Education's Keeping Children Safe in Education and the Children's Act, which is fair enough, but specifically in regard to the requirement to be child-centred and to act in the best interests of the child, which is part of safeguarding, the basis of safeguarding. And to support this, they include lots of evidence of how vulnerable this group of children are. And they state the duty to safeguard and or avoid discrimination might require some form of social transition and operating on a presumption against social transitioning would potentially be unlawful and invite challenge. And they also invoked the Cass review, so the Cass review of the Tavistock Clinic. In her interim report, she said that social transition is not a neutral act. And the CST say that while she said that, she also said doing nothing cannot be considered a neutral act. And I've seen this said before, and I think this is a complete misunderstanding of Cass, because the government draft guidance certainly doesn't suggest doing nothing if a child is in distress. And I don't think that Cass is suggesting that doing nothing means that a child should be socially transitioned a bit. I think she simply means that a child should be supported in normal ways if they're experiencing problems or distress. And there are many, many ways a school can support such a child without socially transitioning them. And all the CST's concerns are based on one presumption, which I think is an erroneous assumption, that gender affirmation is good and it's beneficial to the child. And I want to question that because due to the work of organisations like Stonewall Mermaids, this idea is so thoroughly embedded throughout society as a self-evident truth that it's accepted without question as the basis of school policy. But is it beneficial? And what if it's not? What if actually gender affirmation is harmful for children? What if it's child abuse? What if it's not in the best interests of the child? And what if, contrary to being child-centred, a policy of gender affirmation, in fact, treats the child as an adult, with adult levels of understanding, life experience and self-knowledge? Rather than being in the best interests of the child, what if it's in the best interests of Stonewall? What if it's in the best interests of an ideology? I don't think it's in the best interests of children. But what it does is it politicizes this group of children. Because if affirming a boy's gender identity means calling him a girl, you're expressing the belief that a girl is a gender identity, not a sex. And who does this benefit? And we have to remember that gender affirmation, and maybe we could change this when we talk about it, gender affirmation simply means sex denial. Is it helpful and supportive to a child to deny their sex, a reality that they can never change? And isn't it more likely to encourage them to believe it's possible to medically change sex? And I think from the astronomical rise in referrals to the Tavistock over the past decade, this certainly seems to be the message that children are getting. And I think the EHRC makes the same mistake, assuming that gender affirmation is good, but this time focusing more on the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. And here again, I think there's a misunderstanding about this protected characteristic. Gender reassignment protects the child from discrimination in terms of access to education and services, etc. It does not protect a belief. It does not mean that we have to agree or pretend to agree that a female child is a boy, even if that female child believes it very strongly to herself. And it also does not give adults permission to adultify the child. A child understands gender reassignment at a child's level, not an adult's level. A protected characteristic does not mean that we must forget everything we know about child and adolescent development in the way that we treat that child. And I think that is discrimination against this group. So the EHRC response looks at the issue from an equality and human rights perspective, and I think this is the framework of equalities is also used by NHS England, and I don't think it is the framework that best meets the interests of children. And any framework that you have in schools has to be safeguarding first. And that overrides legislation. Safeguarding, it always comes first with children. And I just want to look at a couple of examples of recent papers. How long have I got? Oh, great. So I'm saying that I think gender affirmation is bad, and I think that a lot of these responses to the school's guidance are based on the assumption that it's good. And so I just want to point out there's so many reasons why I think it's bad, but there's a couple of new papers that I just want to reference here. So one is by Alexander Kort, who's a German clinician researcher. Let's say an expert in this area. He's written papers in the past, very early on, and he's looked at similarities between gender dysphoria and anorexia in teenage girls, because now it's around 3/4 of referrals are teenage girls. And the paper suggests that the current trans-affirmative approach to gender dysphoria in youth and the focus on irreversible physical body modifications obtained before maturity has been achieved is not only at odds with adolescent development, but also may constitute direct iatrogenic harm, which means you are creating the illness by the way you're treating it. And the paper explores the advantages of gender-critical or gender exploratory therapy over trans-affirmative therapy, and states that the authors believe that this is crucial. It also highlights that the desire to transition in these girls cannot be explained in isolation from the current media spotlight on transgender issues. How else could the dramatic increase in the number of cases, especially among female adolescents, be explained and understood? So there's a negative impact on influencers who promote a supposedly easy and risk-free transition, which will solve all of a child's problems. And so I think that's an interesting comparison, and it's been made before, the comparison between gender dysphoria and anorexia in girls. Both are ways that girls try to not exist as females. I mean, I think, but I'm being very simple here, but not to grow up as women. And again, if you think of what affirmation does, to actually affirm a girl as a boy is agreeing with her self-analysis, her self-hatred, and her self-disgust and self-rejection. And again, we would not, in the case of anorexia, it's founded on a belief that the body is fat, and it's a delusional belief. It's not based on reality. And we would never affirm to the anorexic girl that, yes, she's fat, and yes, she does need liposuction, or she needs to starve herself. We would never do that. We also don't put anorexic girls together in a clinic, because we know what happens, that they become competitive in how thin they are, and they encourage each other. But we are always saying that trans kids should be sent to support groups. Schools recommend that. I think that certainly for teenage girls, there's a lot of comparisons you can make between those two conditions, along with body dysmorphia and all the sorts of problems that teenage girls have. And there's another issue that's very recent for this generation of girls, and I certainly think this has had a big influence. And hey presto, there's another recent paper. This is by Karen Ludrowski, who explores how pornography may be a factor in girls' desire to escape womanhood, and suggests that pornographic content may increase the shame and fear of becoming a woman, including the acquisition of misogynistic sexual scripts based on false assumptions on sexuality, including the normalization of the violation of females as pleasurable for them, peer influence among female friendship groups, the susceptibility of our medical systems to mass hysteria phenomena, easier access of adults with sexual abusive intentions to youth through social media, sexual abuse and victim blaming on females, as well as the influence of pornography on mentalisation capacities. And she says that girls affected by autism might be at higher risk, and of course we have a huge disproportionate number of autistic children being referred to gender clinics. And she points out they may be at a higher risk because of their reduced mentalisation capacities. And she says working through experiences associated with pornographic content and sexually abusive experiences may correct false beliefs about gender inequality and therefore might alleviate gender dysphoria. So I think these thoughtful ways and the work of people who are really looking at what are the underlying issues there. So including work of people like Stella, work of people like Sue and Marcus Evans, and the psychologists, psychotherapists, therapists, teachers, professionals who work with children who are concerned about what's going on, an approach that treats individual child as an individual and looks at what is going on in that child's life that has led to such a strong rejection of themselves, of their sex, of their bodies, is a much, much more compassionate approach, really based in safeguarding that child than the thoughtless and unquestioning affirmation of that child's gender identity. So I hope the Lib Dems will support the government's schools guidance and get them to tighten it up. Thank you.
Both of our speakers have had plenty of time to give you their ideas about what ought to be done. And now it's over to you, really, to pose us some questions that we can field for you. Now, Zoe's going to come among you with the microphone. I think for some of us, it's a new ground to be able to be speaking openly and debating and discussing issues which are of great significance for our children, our families, and our communities. Now, I know that we would want to be in dialogue with you, whether you agree with us or not. Liberals debate, that's what we believe. And we can debate and disagree well. And if you want to take part in more debates, you can contact us. You can join us on Liberal Voice for Women, or you can email us and say, no, we don't agree with you because of this. We've also got information for the LGB Liberal Forum, which is, I think, the only party group that has an LGB forum amongst the larger parties. But we do want to have contact with you, and I'm sure that's the case for people in GenSpect and people in Transgender Trend. And I know you were talking about schools. Safe Schools Alliance UK is another place with lots of resources for parents who are concerned about what the schools are doing. But there needs to be a lot more discussion and debate and openness. I'm not scared of talking about these issues because I feel they're so important for our families and our communities.
Thanks very much, Alison. I just wanted to say thank you again to our guests for coming. I know you've made quite the trek to be here. And we'll buy you a glass of wine, I promise after this. But in the interim, please accept these chocolates. I know because you're travelling, we've sent chocolates rather than flowers.